Rev up your engines! Here we have a Mitsubishi Outlander with 240-something thousand miles on it. The guy bought it for $5 grand 100,000 miles ago. Let's see, did he get his money's worth? And it needs a little work too, so you gotta admit, 5 grand, 100,000 miles later, it's still running pretty good. Now, interestingly enough, it's one of those V6 engines, but it doesn't burn any oil. They've obviously changed the oil correctly. Now, the engine and transmission are original. The engine doesn't burn oil. The transmission's never even had the fluid changed, and it works okay. But the owner admitted that they probably spent $8,000 or more maintaining it over those 100,000 miles. They had a lot of work done. And the interior is in decent shape. They got a lot of room. They're carrying a lot of stuff. The rims are still in decent shape. Got dings here and there. You're going to find that in any city where people hit the side of your car while you're parking, like here. Somebody hit the side of them. And yeah, this particular year, they didn't know how to paint them, so you can see the clear coat's coming off. Now you can see as we get in, it's September 2006. That's when they started messing around with that stupid water-based paint, and it just doesn't stick right. Now the new ones, they seem to have figured out, especially Toyota. Their paint seems to stick on pretty good on the real late model ones, but even then I've seen ones that are 6-7 years old in the Toyotas, and the paint's peeling off because that water-based paint, it's all this anti-pollution crap. Oh, we don't want to pollute the atmosphere, blah blah blah. Water-based paint doesn't last and stick as long as oil-based paints. It's a fact. But for the EPA and everything, they're going to water-based paints. That's the way that it is. And when they painted this, they obviously didn't know what they were doing. It's not rusting because it's the clear coat. The primer's still there. It's not going to rust, but it looks bad. And in this case, the rear windows are going out. They have a hard time coming up because the motor's wearing out. But what you really care about, the engine, it's a decent V6. Got the stupid beauty cover. We'll get that out of the way. Now, understand, this is a Rhode Island car. So, you see all this rust. Well, that's just what happens in Rhode Island. Come around here, you can see it's got new struts on. Those have been replaced. Well, let's look at the undercarriage. And it's got a lot of superficial rust, but it's still pretty strong. It's not like the frame's rotten and falling apart or anything. And this particular one is only front-wheel drive, which is probably a better idea on an older vehicle. Heck, I've even seen the all-wheel drive as they get old brake on Toyota Highlanders and stuff. It's a big expense. If you don't need it, you're looking at a used car. Front wheel drive will get you where you're going. They've been driving in Rhode Island here. They're not getting in wrecks with it. Front wheel drive is actually perfectly fine in the snow. Front wheels pull. Pulling is the most efficient way to steer and drive. The rear wheels, you fishtail, not front wheel drive. So don't get carried away like some people do. I have to have all wheel drive because I drive in the snow. It's a bunch of bunk. The front wheel drive ones work perfectly fine. The rear wheel drive ones, you got to really know what you're doing to drive a rear wheel car in the snow. But this is perfectly fine. Let's start it up, see what it sounds like. 240,000 miles. Sounds pretty good. You can hear a little tapping noise and fuel injector noise, but that's no big deal on a car that's this old. It doesn't burn oil. It runs perfectly fine. And yes, the timing belt has been changed. Medium-sized SUV, you really need a V6 engine. The 4s are just too slow. You really need a V6 engine. The check engine light is on. Well, so is the one for tire pressure monitoring, but these systems never work as they age. The batteries go dead. But you can't get it inspected because the service engine light is on. So let's check it. So we'll check it out with the old computer. Here we go, the old roulette wheel. Let's see if it knows what it is. And it knows it's actually an 07. It's a late model 06. Mitsubishi always runs theirs a year ahead of time to make them look newer. It's a trick they've been doing forever. So here's all the stuff we're going to check. The immobilizer codes, which is odd because he said the car starts all the time. Look at that just for kicks. Telling you that the tire reception isn't working because he had rims that he changed and stuff, so we don't care about that. This just shows you that software often isn't perfect because these codes, as you can see, have to do with the tire, right? But it's also hooked in with the immobilization and the keyless system, which is stupid because what does that have to do with your tire pressure? But for some reason, as we'll find here with the TPMS, see, it's got the same codes. It's crazy. There's probably some kind of software glitch. It's the same 6 codes for the immobilizer as for the tire pressure monitoring system, which doesn't make any sense, but softwares often have glitches. And anyways, when you get your car inspected, it doesn't matter if your tire pressure monitoring system here, at least in Rhode Island, is working or not. That doesn't fail the test. His fails because the check engine light is on. And these, they call it service engine soon, but it serves the same thing as the check engine light. And that's right here. So we'll go to there. Okay, it's got 2 codes. It's got PO174, that the fuel trim is too lean. And it also has PO401, that the EGR flow is insufficient. See, when we go through all the codes, there's all kinds of codes that have been stored in the past. And what that means is that none of this stuff has been erased correctly in the past. You get a little cheap scan tool, even a $100 one, it'll erase certain things, but it won't get rid of these massive codes that this thing had. So we're going to start out by just erasing everything. Now, as you can see, it's going to erase everything. They're all disappearing. Now, it's done everything green except for the tire pressure monitoring system, because those things aren't even hooked up, so it's going to keep them red because it knows they're not there. But what we care about is the check engine light. So now we reset it. We'll start it up and we'll look at some data. Let's look at the data stream. Now we can see a big difference between the fuel trim on number 1 and the fuel trim on number 2. One's 1.95%, which is totally acceptable. But fuel trim on number 2, it's adding 12%. So that's the one that's running lean. Now, wouldn't you know it, bank 2, the lean one, is the one here under the intake manifold. Why couldn't it be this one that you could access? But it's the back one, that's the one that's running lean. Now here's a test anybody can do. You see, we're idling the long-term fuel trim. Watch what happens when I rev it up. The fuel trim goes down. And that pretty much confirms that the thing has a small vacuum leak on the back side. Bank number 2, facing the back. Because a vacuum leak affects the idle most. When you rev up the engine, it's sucking more air, and a little leak is going to affect it less. There's a small leak on the back side, which is going to be a stinker to figure out. Now, it runs good enough, he doesn't care. But he's got to get it to pass the test. Now realize that small amount of running too lean at idle eventually will trip the code, but it might not trip the code long enough to do a road test so you can get the inspection test. It might be able to go through the get ready and have it pass the test, even though it's got a small leak. But the EGR system, it won't pass unless that's working. Look at the short-term fuel trim, and you can see the 1 is almost perfect, but you're still adding 8. It's running lean on 2. We'll rev it up and see what happens. See how it goes down to almost normal for a little. But then you notice it was actually subtracting fuel too. So there's more than meets the eye here. My advice with this would be, try a can of really good fuel injector cleaner in the tank, because it could be that the fuel injectors are part of the problem, because they both bounced around in the short term, which is the more accurate what's happening in the short term. They both actually started subtracting a little bit of fuel, so it could be a fuel injectors are somewhat clogged. I mean, the thing's got 245,000 miles on it. If you were a fanatic, you'd replace them all, but they're not cheap. And a lot of times, since it runs so good, you can get it good by running some cleaner in it. So we're going to take it with a road test, and I'll watch the data. Well, the machine will anyway. So we'll look at the data that recorded. We'll play the data stream. And lo and behold, there's no power going to the EGR valve to turn it on and off. The computer is shorted out. There's nothing coming out of the computer. Now, that's typical with Mitsubishi. It's a typical problem with Mitsubishi. They have weak computers. The circuit that drives the EGR has blown. Now, nobody knows what happened. It easily could have been that the original EGR valve shorted out. When it shorted out, there's no fuse between the EGR valve and the computer. It's just a wire that holds a whopping 5 volts and so many milliamps, very little power. They get a short, they often fry the driver circuits. The computer would have to be replaced to make the stupid EGR system work correctly, because it's a computer-run EGR. It isn't just some simple vacuum one like they used to be. Runs fine, there aren't any problems other than it's running a little bit lean at idle on bank number 2. That's the problem when you have an old car and you have to get it inspected. You got to deal with this craziness. Now, if he was in Tennessee with me 2 months from now and he lived there, he wouldn't care because they don't inspect him. But that's the hassle that happens when you get an older car and it's got to meet these stupid emission standards. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about it. And here's some bonus questions and answers. And Babington says, I got O3 matrix, so the AM2 fuse keeps blowing. I can't find anything at fault with the wiring or the starter relay. Keeps blowing that fuse after it runs for a while. Then it just quits. What could it be? That's a horrible fuse. The AM2 fuse on a Toyota runs all kinds of stuff. First thing it runs is the ignition switch. So what you want to do is check the ignition switch first. Maybe just buy another one, the electrical portion. If that's shorting out inside, That's exactly what'll happen. But unfortunately, after that, that ignition switch feeds just about everything in the car. And you would have to trace the whole system down to find out where the short is. It could be just about anywhere. Now, you said you got an 03 matrix. Okay, if it was a really older Toyota, what happens is there's a part in the distributor that goes bad, and you'd have to replace the distributor. It wouldn't blow that fuse anymore, but that doesn't have a distributor. That's a matrix. It's all run by computer. It's got coil on plug ignition system. It could be as simple as you got a bad ignition coil. You might have those checked out first, because ignition coils do run off that. They use a lot of power, and when it blows, of course, your car isn't going to run. You might check that too, but I'd start with the ignition switch, because that's what all the power goes to. Then it goes from the ignition switch all over the place, and all over the place means all over the place. You'd have to check everything. Pray it's just a bad ignition switch. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.